words of my mouth and the meditation of every present heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Has anyone ever heard of the Semmelweis Effect? Well, you're going to today. Now, it's a rather important thing. It was named after a man whose name was, you could not make this a harder name, Ignaz Semmelweis. German by heritage, Hungarian by birth. He lived in the early to mid 1800s, and he was an obstetrician, a physician in Vienna. In fact, during his career, he was a pretty good physician. He rose to the rank of being given charge of a ward of the maternity ward of the Vienna hospital. Now, this is part of the reason why the Semmelweis effect exists. And I have to say, it sounds pretty neat to have an effect named after you. I don't think most people start out with that as a goal, but nonetheless, Ignaz Semmelweis will forever be known by the Semmelweis effect. In some ways, he was chosen. I think truly he was chosen by God, and through his vocation, this became abundantly clear. And it became abundantly clear in the way that Jesus teaches us about blessings here in the Sermon on the Mount. You see, Ignaz, is that going to be easier than hearing Semmelweis again and again? The good doctor, let's say. The good doctor had a problem. At that time in the mid-1800s, the maternity wards that he was working in the Vienna hospital had maternal mortality rates of up to 18 to 20%. Nearly 1 in 5 women who went into these places to give birth did not make it out or did not make it out without being terminal. And Ignaz and the rest of the doctors, well, they were somewhat ignorant as to the reason why. In his day, the doctors, of course, had figured out medicine. Everything related to the 4 humors that were in your body related to the 4 elements of the earth. And they knew this to be true, as much as they knew anything else. But one day, a tragedy befell our good Dr. Semmelweis. A friend and colleague of his died. And he died a couple weeks after performing an autopsy, as the doctors did. They did both of these things. They treated the living and they explored the dead. And during this exam, his friend, with the scalpel, had pierced his own finger, and from that became sick and died. And so turning this over in his head and trying to figure out what he could do about this very high mortality rate that was going on in his own hospital, Ignaz decided that it had something to do with cleanliness, something to do with the doctors moving from the mortuary and back into the birthing wards. Now, he was stumbling on to the germ theory of health and wellness, but he didn't quite understand it yet. He thought it had something to do with that, well, dead person. And so he said there were cadaverous particles of some way that these doctors were carrying from where they were to where they were going. And so he made it a point that he and everyone else in his ward of the hospital, before they went into labor and delivery, would take their hands and wash them in a chlorine-based solution. And mortality rates for women dropped from near 20% down to sometimes as low as 2%. The Semmelweis effect. And it's called that because the germ theory of health and wellness was not yet accepted in Vienna, not by a long shot. In fact, the doctors of Vienna were somewhat taken aback and really, well, they were, let's say, put off by this idea. Because they were men of privilege, they were men of wealth, and they were men of class. And to even say that their hands could be dirty enough to make someone sick was below them. It had nothing to do with the 4 humors that they knew caused everything anyway. And so not only did these fellow doctors not adopt this cleansing of the hands, but they ridiculed Semmelweis. They excluded him. It cost him his job at the maternity ward. The Semmelweis effect is in fact the idea that when new information is presented, even new information presented with evidence behind it, if it goes against the greater thinking, it will not only be rejected, but it will be forcefully rejected. So Dr. Semmelweis after he was driven out of his hospital, after he was driven out of Vienna, kept persisting in his call that doctors everywhere do this. And he just wouldn't stop talking about it. And the more that he talked about it, and the more that his colleagues seemed to ignore him or ridicule him, the angrier he got about it. Because he was watching people die, and he felt they shouldn't have to. Women in the streets of Vienna would do everything they could while he was still working at the hospital not to go to the other ward. Sometimes, if they were assigned the other ward, they would try to give birth in the street before they went in. And he had a problem with this, as he should. He saw it as wrong. He saw it as unrighteous and unjust, as it was. And it cost him everything. So much so that after all this pent-up anger was expressed and all of this frustration and all of this yelling at his colleagues for something that to him seemed so obvious, conspired on by another colleague who lured him to come see his new mental institution, he was taken into custody and he was admitted against his will. Now, the true irony of Dr. Semmelweis's life is, during that initial entry into the mental institution, he was beaten by the guards, as was standard practice, and he received a cut on his hand. And the cut became gangrenous and infected, probably because the doctor who saw him for his wounds hadn't washed his hands. And he died some weeks later of the very infection that he helped prevent for so many others. Now we have the Semmelweis Effect. And in fact, there are multiple universities and medical schools around the world named for Semmelweis. And his name has gone from being dragged through the gutter in his own day to something that is celebrated and lauded. There are statues of him that litter the towns of Hungary and throughout Europe. Here in today's gospel reading, Jesus gives us a vision of blessing that is not like the world would give us. Now, sometimes we hear this and we hear it too piously. Blessed are the meek, and blessed are the peacemakers, and blessed are those who mourn. And we hear it so much piously because the outrageous nature of what he is really saying is hard for us to both comprehend and accept. It is not only that people in these conditions will be blessed on account of what will happen to them. That is part of what Jesus is saying. But what he is saying is you are blessed, and you are favored by God, and you are specially chosen right here and right now in these conditions that the rest of the world would look at and say are anything but. In fact, this very form of rhetoric that he's using was common in his day, common throughout the Holy Land and other preachers who would say that blessed are those who are wealthy, and blessed are those who are well taken care of, and blessed are those who have power, and blessed are those who have big families, and blessed are those who do not mourn and who have strength. Basically, everyone who has everything going right, right? Because sometimes that's what we associate the word blessing with. And so we hear these words of Jesus, and sometimes we take them as, this is something I can try to be a little bit more like, so that this good thing might come later. But that's really not what Jesus is saying at all. Look to Dr. Semmelweis, a truly blessed man. Not because he headed a maternity ward, not because he was a respected doctor at some point, not because, well, all of the other good things in his life. He was a blessed man because he thirsted for righteousness and justice, and it cost him everything. And in that moment of the world rejecting him as foolish, God was lifting him up and drawing him to himself as one who was appointed to do something, as one who was favored. One time, towards the end of my first call, I received a gift from a woman in my congregation named Mary, and it was one of these sort of placards that you find sold at like Hobby Lobby. It's a nice gift, and we still keep it displayed, but I've always thought it was a little bit incomplete. It said, God's got a plan, and it's all good. And that's true. Because blessed are the meek, and blessed are the mourning, and blessed are the peacemakers, and blessed are those who thirst for righteousness. However, some of that goodness is based on the trial that they currently undergo. And if that seems strange and foolish to us, that's okay. We're human, and that's how we naturally react to it. The Semmelweis Effect, maybe, in action. How could it be that those who mourn, that those are lowly in society, the meek and the powerless, how could it be that they're blessed? But here, Jesus teaches us that, in fact, that's exactly the way that God sees the world. And in our own moments, not in those moments when we strive to be these things more and more. No. In our own moments, when you feel like the world has broken you, when you feel like God has left you, when you feel like you have almost been betrayed, and you can't understand why, here Jesus says, truly you have found God's favor. And it is the most strangest sort of thing to say, but the most powerful sort of promise to believe. Because in those moments when we are like that, God has not abandoned us, God has grown closer to us. And the more that we can embrace the idea that this life was not meant to be perfect, and that the absence of perfection is not the absence of God, the more that we can embrace the idea that the glory of the life of Dr. Semmelweis was his saving lives in real time as he was rejected by the world, the more that we can understand that the life of the Christian is the life of the cross. Maybe, just maybe, we can understand these words of Jesus. I appreciate the gift that Miss Mary got me on my way out the door of my first call, but I've always thought it needed a bit of an asterisk. The type Jesus gives here. God's got a plan, and it's all good. It just might involve crucifixion on the way, or persecution, or suffering, or mourning, or meekness, or failure. Blessed are those. Blessed are us. For God has not left us, but God uses us in those moments. God has not driven us down, God raises us up. And God is not done with us. Because the promise of what is to come is not only to show that we will be blessed, but it's to remind us of the endurance that God will put forth in his own way in our own lives. Blessed are you when you feel like you are the least blessed you could be. Know that God is with you. And know that it's all good. Amen.